You married my brother. Now my brother is dead, and you're sitting here telling me you've never even met him." The man who said it didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone was flat and even, but heavy enough to pull the air right out of the room. Jolene Ward looked him straight in the eyes. Her fingers gripped the edge of the chair, but her voice held steady. "I don't know your brother. I didn't sign that paper. And 12 hours ago, the only thing on my mind was $200 for rent." 12 hours ago, Jolene Ward had been standing in line at a bank. 12 hours later, she was sitting across from one of the most dangerous men in the city, accused of defrauding a dead man she had never even known existed. And the worst part was that, on paper, she was his legal wife. This is the story of Jolene Ward. Welcome to our channel. If you're ready, let's begin. If this story moved you, hit like and share it so more people can hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one, because the best story might be the one you haven't heard yet. 12 hours earlier, Jolene Ward wasn't anyone's wife. She was only a 27-year-old woman standing in line at the bank on a Thursday afternoon, holding her debit card in her hand, her mind quietly calculating whether the $200 she planned to withdraw that day would be enough to pay the rent and still leave something for groceries through the week. There were 3 people ahead of her. She counted them one by one, not because she was impatient, but because counting helped her not think about other numbers, the numbers that were always short, always negative, always chasing her from the beginning of the month to the end of the month. Then it was her turn. The teller took her card, typed on the computer, then stopped, typed again, stopped again. The teller's eyes changed. Not much, only a little, but enough for Jolene to notice. It was a look she had seen many times in her life. The look of someone trying to decide what to say to the person in front of them without creating trouble for themselves. "Please wait a moment." The teller picked up the internal phone. 1 minute later, the branch manager appeared, a middle-aged man in a gray suit, his face polite but already in a defensive mode before he even opened his mouth. "Miss Ward, please come into the room inside." Jolene wanted to ask why, but she knew that people like her, when invited into a private room anywhere, were usually not being invited there to receive good news. She followed him. A small room, 1 table, 2 chairs, white fluorescent light. The manager sat down across from her and placed a sheet of paper in front of her. An asset freeze order, issued by a federal court, connected to a financial fraud investigation. And the name on the order wasn't Jolene Ward. It was Jolene Langston. "I don't know that last name," she said. The manager didn't argue. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem outside his authority, then told her she needed to contact the court to clarify the matter. The money she wanted to withdraw was still in her account. She couldn't touch it. Jolene walked out of the bank with the paper in her hand, and not a single dollar in her pocket. 2 men were already waiting outside. They weren't in uniform, but the way they stood, the way they watched her from a distance and then moved closer the moment she stepped through the door, told her who they were before they even pulled out their badges. "Detectives." "Jolene Ward?" "Yes. You need to come with us." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. She got into their car. The police station in the late afternoon had the kind of light that made everything look grayer than it really was. The interrogation room was smaller than she had imagined, with 1 metal table, 2 chairs, and 3 documents laid out in front of her in an order that felt as if someone had already calculated which blow should land first. The first document was a marriage certificate between Jolene Ward and Corey Langston, with her signature in the lower right corner. The second document was a property transfer worth $2,300,000 under the name Jolene Langston. The third document was a death certificate. Corey Langston, 28 years old, dead in a traffic accident 3 weeks earlier. "How long have you known Corey Langston?" the detective asked. "I'd never heard that name before today," Jolene said. The detective looked at her. It was the look of someone who had heard hundreds of similar sentences from hundreds of different people and didn't believe a single one of them. "Your signature is on the marriage certificate, Miss Ward. $2,300,000 is in your name. Your husband died 3 weeks ago, and you're saying you don't know him." "He isn't my husband. According to the court documents, he is." Jolene said nothing more, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood that in this room, with these papers, her truth carried less weight than a signature on paper. They kept her for 4 hours. They asked the same questions again and again in different ways. She answered the same way every time, because the truth had only one version. In the end, they let her go. Not enough evidence to charge her, but enough suspicion to keep the file open. Jolene Ward walked out of the police station at 11 o'clock at night. The sidewalk was empty. A street light flickered at the end of the block. She stood there for a while, still holding the freeze order, now wrinkled from being folded too many times. No money, no lawyer, not a single phone number in her contacts she could call at 11 o'clock at night and say, "I need help," with any real hope that someone on the other end would actually pick up. Jolene Ward began to walk. She didn't know where she was going, but standing still had never been something she knew how to do. She had walked half a block when she noticed the black SUV. It was parked across the street, lights off, engine running, parked the way people park when they aren't waiting for a space, but waiting for a person. Jolene didn't stop walking. She had lived long enough in unsafe neighborhoods to know that when you saw something suspicious, the best thing to do was keep moving and pretend you hadn't seen it. She walked on. The SUV began to roll forward, slowly. It kept exactly to her pace. No faster, no slower, as if the driver were measuring each of her steps with the steering wheel. Jolene turned right at the corner. The SUV turned with her. She stopped, not because she wanted to, but because she understood that going on wouldn't change anything. If the person inside that vehicle wanted to find her, they already had. And if they wanted something bad to happen, it would have happened the moment she left the station with no one watching. The SUV stopped about 10 steps away from her. The rear door opened. A man stepped out, tall, broad, moving with the spare economy of someone used to doing everything quickly and cleanly. He didn't come any closer than necessary. He only stood beside the car door and said one sentence. "Mr. Langston wants to talk." Langston. The last name she had heard for the first time at the bank that afternoon. The last name on the death certificate of the man she was supposedly married to. And now another Mr. Langston wanted to talk to her. Jolene looked at the man standing beside the car. Then she looked at the road behind her. The sidewalk was empty. The streetlight flickered, and not a single person passed by. She had nowhere to go. Her studio apartment had unpaid rent. Her account was frozen, and if she turned around and walked away now, this man, or the Mr. Langston sitting in that car, would still find her. She got into the car. The man in the back seat didn't greet her. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't look at her when she sat down. He sat slightly angled toward the opposite door, one hand resting on his thigh, the other on the armrest. The streetlights outside slid across his face in pulses. Light, then dark, light, then dark. And each time the light touched him, Jolene saw another piece of him. A hard jaw, gray eyes, a faint scar running along the left side of his jawbone. The kind of face that didn't need to say much to be heard. Then he spoke. "You married my brother. Now my brother is dead. And you're sitting here telling me you've never met him." Jolene looked straight into his eyes. Her hand tightened around the edge of the seat, but her voice didn't shake. "I don't know your brother. I didn't sign that paper. And 12 hours ago, the only thing I was worried about was $200 for rent at the end of the month." The man didn't react right away. He looked at her, the way a person looks when he is reading. Not reading words, but reading whatever lies behind them. The way her eyes moved, the way her hand clenched. The way her breathing stayed steady even though her voice tightened at the end of the sentence. The silence stretched. The car kept moving. Jolene didn't know where it was going, and she didn't ask, because she understood that in a situation like this, the person asking questions was the person holding power, and that person wasn't her. "My name is Broderick Langston," he said. "Corey Langston was my brother. My brother died 3 weeks ago, and 1 week after the funeral, the attorney handling the estate sent me notice that my brother had a legal wife, a woman named Jolene Ward, whom my brother had never mentioned, not once. In all the 28 years I knew him." He tilted his head, just a little, enough for the next sweep of streetlight to fall fully across his face. "You understand why I wanted to talk." Jolene understood. She understood that this man wasn't the police, wasn't a lawyer, wasn't the kind of person who sat behind a desk and sent a summons. This man belonged to another kind, the kind who came looking himself, asked himself, and decided for himself whether to believe or not believe by reading the face of the person across from him in a private car near midnight. "I don't know Corey Langston," Jolene said, for the second time that day. But this time she said it more slowly, more clearly, because she knew the person listening now wasn't like the detective at the station. This man listened in order to judge, and the consequence of that judgment wouldn't be simply letting her go or keeping her there. I didn't sign that marriage certificate. I don't know where that $2,300,000 came from, and I don't want a single dollar of it." Broderick Langston looked at her. For a long time, it was a look that didn't seem angry, didn't seem hateful, only coldly calculating, the look of a man weighing every gram of truth on a scale only he could see. And Jolene realized one thing. He didn't believe her yet. But he also hadn't decided she was lying, because a liar would have a prepared story, would have details, times, and neatly arranged logic ready to answer questions. Jolene had nothing at all, only the naked truth that she didn't understand what was happening to her own life. And sometimes, real confusion was more convincing than any explanation. The SUV stopped in front of a high-rise building downtown. Tully opened the door, said nothing, and simply walked ahead. Jolene followed, then Brick. The elevator rose to the top floor. The penthouse was so quiet that Jolene could hear the sound of her own shoes against the wooden floor. Brick pulled out a chair at the table in the middle of the room, not as an invitation, but as an order. "Sit." Jolene sat. She understood that the elevator door that had just closed behind her wasn't a door she could open from the inside by herself. There were no locks, no ropes, but Tully was standing beside the exit, and Broderick Langston was seated across from her with the patience of a man who never needed to hurry, because everything waited for him, not the other way around. Brick opened a desk drawer, took out a file about 20 pages thick, and placed it in front of Jolene. He didn't toss it. He didn't throw it. He set it down gently, precisely, close enough for her to reach. "Read it." Jolene opened the file. The first page was a copy of her birth certificate, with no parental names listed under guardian. The second page was a list of the addresses where she had lived over the past 10 years. 7 addresses, no place longer than 2 years. Most of them cheap rented rooms or shared studio apartments. The third page was her employment history: the dental clinic during the day, the diner at night, before that a convenience store cashier, and before that, washing dishes for a small restaurant in the suburbs. The fourth page was her bank statement. The balance before the freeze was $472.17. Jolene turned the pages one by one. She looked at her life spread out on white paper in black ink, neat, accurate, and so pitiful that she wanted to close it, but didn't. $472. That was all her 27 years of life were worth, if measured in money. Brick watched her read. He didn't say a word the entire time. He didn't need to. The file itself was already a question. "I know everything about you. So do you want to try lying now? A person with $472 in her account," Brick said when she reached the last page, "suddenly has $2.3 million in her name. You understand why I'm sitting here." Jolene closed the file. "If you know everything, then you also know I'm not capable of carrying out any scheme worth $2.3 million. Look at that file. I can't even afford a lawyer." Brick didn't react. He took a sheet of paper that had been separated inside the file and placed it in front of Jolene. The marriage certificate. Her name on the left, Corey Langston's name on the right, and at the bottom, the signature. "Look closely," Brick said. Jolene looked. The signature in the lower right corner slanted to the right, the J slightly looped, the W drawn out. It looked 95% like her signature, but Jolene knew she hadn't signed this paper. She knew because she remembered every time she had ever put her pen to anything, because when you grow up with no one to protect you, you learn that your signature is the last thing you give away, and you never give it away without knowing what you're signing. Except once. The memory came without warning. 6 months earlier, the dental clinic, in the middle of the afternoon shift, patients waiting in a full room, she was handling 3 overlapping appointments when a new employee named Doug placed a stack of papers in front of her. "Employee insurance. Sign here. Management needs it before the end of the day." The stack was thick, the print small. She asked whether she needed to read it carefully. Doug said no. Everyone had already signed. It was just procedure. Don't keep management waiting. She signed, in a hurry, in the middle of her shift, without reading, because she believed insurance papers at a dental clinic were insurance papers at a dental clinic, and not something else. Doug worked at the clinic for 2 months. Then he quit. No one asked why. No one could contact him afterward. She didn't even remember Doug's full last name. Jolene looked up from the marriage certificate. 6 months ago, there was a new employee at the clinic where I worked. His name was Doug. He gave me a stack of papers and said they were employee insurance forms. I signed in a hurry. He quit 2 months later, and no one could find him. She stopped. I think my signature on this paper came from that stack. Brick said nothing. He turned the mechanical watch on his wrist, slowly, one full turn, then looked toward Tully. Tully had already taken out his phone. He didn't need Brick to say it aloud. 19 years working beside each other teaches people to read one another through gestures, not sentences. Tully wrote down a name. Doug. Brick looked back at Jolene. She sat there, not crying, not begging, not trying to make herself look pitiful. She only sat with the exhaustion of someone who had been asked the same question too many times in one day, and no longer had the energy to do anything except tell the truth. Brick didn't believe her yet, but he noted one thing. She had given him a name he didn't have, and liars usually don't offer clues that lead to something that can be verified. The next morning, Brick sat at the desk in the penthouse with the marriage certificate in front of him. He wasn't looking at the signature. He was looking at the small line in the lower left corner, where the notary's name was written. Margot Sable. He read that name twice, not because it was unclear, but because he was placing it in the proper spot inside his memory, where every name was arranged beside one question. Who does this person owe? Who does this person fear? And who does this person work for? Tully stood beside the window, phone pressed to his ear, taking notes with his left hand. He hung up and turned back. Corey's estate papers went through an attorney named Paxton Greer. Greer runs a real estate consulting firm on the north side of the city. Corey worked as an accountant for a company connected to Greer during his final 2 years. Brick knew the name Paxton Greer. Not in the way one knows a friend or a partner, but in the way one remembers having once sat at the same table during a real estate deal a few years earlier. The kind of deal where the paperwork was suspiciously clean, and the attorney handling it was so polite that no one wanted to ask another question. Greer belonged to the kind of people Brick met once, then filed away under useful, but not trustworthy. Now that name was sitting on his brother's estate papers, beside the name of a woman his brother had never mentioned. When did the estate attorney send notice to our family? Brick asked. 10 days after Corey died, before the police opened the investigation file, Tully answered. So Brick had known Jolene Ward's name before the police did. He had sent people to look into her before the legal system even had time to knock on her door. And all he had found was a woman with $472 in her account. No family, no legal history, clean to a point that made no sense for someone accused of a $2,300,000 fraud. Brick remembered his last phone call with Corey. 3 days before his brother's accident, Corey had said, "Brother, I need to tell you something," then stopped, then said, "Never mind, another time." And Brick had said, "All right," then hung up, because he was in the middle of a meeting he had thought was more important. He hadn't asked anything more. Brick turned the watch on his wrist, slowly, then said to Tully, "Find Margot Sable. Find everything she has notarized in the past 5 years connected to Greer." At the same time, Jolene Ward was standing in front of the dental clinic that had fired her the day before. Brick hadn't kept her in the penthouse. He had let her go in the morning, with no explanation, only saying, "If I need you, I'll find you." That wasn't a promise. It was a fact, and Jolene understood both meanings. She came to the clinic not to ask for her job back. She came because last night, after seeing the signature on the marriage certificate, she hadn't been able to sleep. She had lain on the sofa in the penthouse of a Mafia boss and thought about Doug, about the stack of insurance papers, about the 2 months he worked there and then disappeared, and she realized that if there was any evidence proving where her signature had been taken from, it was inside that clinic. She didn't wait for Brick to find it for her. She went herself. The clinic hadn't opened yet, but she knew the schedule. She called an old coworker, the only person who still answered the phone, and asked to come in to get her personal belongings from her locker. Her coworker hesitated, but agreed. Jolene went in, gathered her things in 3 minutes, and used the remaining 7 minutes to search. The employee file cabinet was in the back room. She opened the D drawer. Doug's file was still there, a thin job application, a home address, a phone number, and on the line marked "Reference" was the name of the clinic manager. The clinic manager, the same person who had fired her yesterday without asking her a single question, was the person who had brought Doug in. Jolene took a photo with her phone. Then she searched further. In the administrative file drawer, she found a copy of the stack of papers she had signed 6 months earlier. Employee insurance, yes, but not only insurance. The 4th page in the stack wasn't an insurance form. It was legal content, professional language she didn't fully understand, but her signature was at the bottom of the page, and Corey Langston's name had been printed in advance on the line beside it. She photographed everything. 10 minutes. In. Search. Take. Out. No one knew she had been looking for anything besides her personal belongings. That afternoon, Jolene placed her phone in front of Brick. Photos of Doug's file. Photos of the document page with her signature beside Corey Langston's name. Photos of the clinic manager's name on the reference line. Brick looked at each picture. Slowly, carefully. Then he looked up at Jolene. Not the same look from last night. The look that measured whether she was telling the truth or lying. This was a different kind of look. The look of someone reassessing everything he thought about the person in front of him. Jolene Ward had no money to hire a lawyer. No one to protect her. No power and no connections. But she had enough presence of mind to return by herself to the place that had thrown her out, find evidence on her own, and bring it back to set before him before he even had time to demand it. Brick didn't say well done or thank you. He only looked at Tully and nodded once, the kind of nod Tully understood to mean, this person isn't the enemy. 2 days later, Brick called Jolene to the penthouse. Not through Tully this time. He called her directly, using the phone number she had given him when she left the day before. A short message, with no greeting, only the address and the time. Jolene arrived exactly on time. She brought an old gym bag with her, the kind of zippered cloth bag people bought at thrift stores for a few dollars, and inside it was everything she owned. Brick looked at that bag when she set it down on the floor beside the chair. He didn't ask. He didn't need to ask. That bag said more than any answer could have. It said Jolene Ward no longer had anywhere else to put that bag except beside her own feet. "Where are you staying?" Brick asked. "At the diner where I work, the night shift. The manager lets me sleep in the employee break room. Temporarily." "How long is temporarily?" "Until he finds a reason to say no," Jolene said, her voice flat, without self-pity, simply describing reality the way people describe the weather. Brick looked at her. She was sitting in the same chair from the first night. But she was different. That first night, she had sat like someone pushed into a room without knowing why. Now she sat like someone who knew where she was, and was waiting to see what would happen next. More tired, but more awake. Brick placed 2 photographs on the table. The first was a photo of Margot Sable from the notary file. The second was a photo of Paxton Greer from the real estate company's website. "The person who notarized your marriage certificate is Margot Sable," he said. "The attorney who handled all of my brother's estate papers is Paxton Greer." Corey worked as an accountant for a company connected to Greer during the final 2 years of his life. He stopped, not to create drama, but because the next sentence was one he had weighed for the past 2 days. "I don't fully believe you yet, but someone used you, and that person, or those people, may be connected to my brother's death. You help me find them. In return, I keep you safe from the police, and from anyone who wants you silent." Jolene looked at the 2 photographs on the table. 2 faces she had never seen before. One person had certified her false marriage. One person had handled the papers of the husband she had on paper but had never met. Both of them were beyond her reach if she acted alone. She had no money, no lawyer, no power. And out there, in the federal court system, she was still Jolene Langston, the legal wife of a dead man, a suspect in a financial fraud case. If Brick found the person he needed to find and then walked away, she would still be trapped. The file would still be open. The Langston name would still be attached to her, and the police would still believe she was guilty. She needed evidence to clear herself, not from Brick, but from the very investigation Brick was beginning to open. "All right," Jolene said. "But I don't owe you. This is an exchange. You need me to find out what happened to your brother. I need you to prove I'm not the person the papers say I am." Brick looked at her for a while. It wasn't the look of evaluation anymore. It was closer to acknowledgement. The look of someone rearranging another person's place on the map of relationships he carried in his head, moving her from the box marked unclear to another box he hadn't yet named. "Tully will take you to an apartment on the east side. It belongs to my organization. Safe. No one knows you're there. I'll pay the rent when my account is unfrozen," Jolene said. Brick almost curved his mouth. Almost. But he didn't. He only nodded once, then stood. The conversation was over. Not because everything had been said, but because enough had been said. Jolene picked up her bag and followed Tully out to the elevator. She didn't turn back to look at Brick, and Brick didn't look after her. But after the elevator doors closed, he stood beside the table for a while longer, looking at the two photographs on the tabletop, Margot Sable and Paxton Greer, then at the chair where Jolene had just been sitting, where her old gym bag had rested on the floor, holding an entire human life inside a single zipper. Brick wasn't a man who often thought about fairness. The world he lived in didn't run on fairness. It ran on power and consequences. But there was something about Jolene Ward, about the way she said, "I don't owe you," as if it were the last thing she still had left to hold, that made him pause longer than usual before turning back to his work. Margot Sable lived in a rented house in the western suburbs, the kind of house with a small front yard and curtains that were always drawn shut. Tully found the address within one day. Brick didn't call ahead. He never called ahead. That afternoon, Brick and Tully arrived. Jolene sat in the car and waited. That was the plan Brick had arranged beforehand. Jolene wouldn't go in yet. It wasn't time. Margot opened the door after the second knock. She was a 50-year-old woman, with the kind of face people trusted the moment they saw it. The kind of face made to sit behind a notary counter and make the person across from her feel that everything was legal. She looked at Brick, then at Tully, and she knew at once that these men were neither clients nor neighbors. "Mrs. Sable," Brick said. It wasn't a question. Only confirmation. "How can I help you?" "You can invite me in." She invited him in, not out of courtesy, but because there was no other choice when Broderick Langston was standing at your front door. The Langston name carried its own weight in this city, the kind of weight that didn't require explanation. The living room was small. Brick sat across from Margot. Tully stood beside the door. He didn't sit. He never sat when Brick was working. Brick didn't ask right away. He looked at Margot, silently, for a long time. The kind of silence ordinary people would rush to fill with words because they couldn't bear it. And that was exactly what Brick was waiting for. Margot lasted about 30 seconds. "What do you want to ask about?" "Corey Langston," Brick said. 2 words. Margot didn't react openly, but her hand shifted from the armrest of the chair down to her lap, a small movement someone untrained in observation would have missed. Brick didn't miss anything. "I know you notarized the marriage certificate bearing my brother's name," he said. "I want to know who asked you to do it," Margot swallowed. "I notarize many documents, Mr. Langston. I don't remember every single set. You'll remember this one," Brick said, "because the person on that paper is dead." The second silence lasted longer than the first. Margot looked down at her hands. "I followed the attorney's request. Paxton Greer. He sent the documents. I notarized them. A few sets over, a few years. I didn't ask for details. How many is a few? I don't remember exactly." Brick looked at her. He knew she hadn't told him everything. It was the way people speak when they open the door just enough not to be seen as refusing to cooperate, but not enough to expose the truly dangerous thing behind it. Brick stood. Slowly, without hurry, he fastened the button of his suit jacket again, a small habit he had whenever he was ending a conversation that wasn't truly finished. "You're still useful, so you're still sitting here," he said, his voice neither rising nor falling. "The next time I come back, I'll bring the person whose name you signed away." He looked at Tully. Tully opened the door, and Jolene Ward stepped in. Margot looked at Jolene. Jolene looked at Margot. The two women had never met, but one of them had certified the other's non-existent marriage, and they both knew it. Jolene didn't shout. She didn't get angry. She pulled out a chair and sat across from Margot, closer than Brick had sat, and looked straight into her eyes. "You said a few sets of documents," Jolene said. "In those documents, how many women were like me? No family, no relatives, no one who would call to check if one day they couldn't be reached anymore." Margot didn't answer right away, but her eyes changed. For the past 4 years, Margot Sable had notarized dozens of files for Paxton Greer. For 4 years, she had signed her name to confirm marriages between men she had never met and women whose faces she had never seen. They had only been names on paper, signatures on a line, numbers in a ledger. Now one of those names was sitting across from her in flesh and blood, with tired eyes and an old gym bag placed beside her feet, asking her how many women like her had passed through Margot's hands. Margot broke. Not loudly, not with tears spilling everywhere, only in the way her shoulders collapsed and her voice lost the shell of control she had held since opening the door. 15 women in 4 years. All of them had no family, no close relatives. Paxton chose them very carefully. Their signatures were taken in different ways, hidden inside stacks of employment papers, inside applications for medical assistance, inside rental agreements. The women were married on paper to men who needed to transfer assets, conceal inheritance rights, or launder money through the name of a legal wife. Some of the women couldn't be reached afterward. Margot didn't know what happened to them. Or she knew, but had learned not to ask. Then Margot talked about Corey. Corey Langston had discovered the operation while working as an accountant. He found Jolene's file in the system and understood that she was about to be put on the next list. Corey met with Paxton and demanded that Jolene's name be removed. Paxton agreed. On the surface. 2 weeks later, Corey was in a traffic accident, and the marriage certificate between Jolene Ward and Corey Langston was completed after Corey was already dead. The room went silent. Brick stood beside the window, his back turned to Margot. He had heard every word, and every word had settled into its proper place in the picture he had been piecing together for the past 3 weeks. His brother hadn't died in an accident. His brother had died because he had tried to save a woman he had never met, simply because he had read her file and seen that she had no one. Brick stepped out into the hallway. His hand gripped the railing, his knuckles turning white. He didn't speak. Tully followed him out and stood 2 steps behind him. He didn't speak either. The 2 men stood in the quiet hallway of a suburban house, and neither of them said a single word, because no word was enough for the moment, when an older brother understood that his younger brother had died not because he was weak, not because he was foolish, but because Corey Langston, in his short life, had been the only person in the Langston family who believed that doing the right thing mattered more than doing the safe thing. After leaving Margot Sable's house, Brick didn't return to the penthouse. He sat in the car and made 3 phone calls. The first call was to the financial manager of the Langston organization, asking only one question. In the 6 months before Corey died, had anyone in the organization received any outside payment that hadn't gone through the approval system? The second call was to the head of security, asking, during those 6 months, had anyone received any instruction related to Corey without reporting it to him? On the third call, he didn't ask anything. He only listened. Then he hung up. The answer came within 1 day. One name, Wes. A man inside the organization, working in the department that handled real estate transactions, the very area Corey had once been connected to when he worked as an accountant for Paxton Greer's company. Wes had received 2 cash payments from Greer within the 3 months before Corey died. Not large. Enough to buy silence. Not enough to attract attention. In return, Wes hadn't reported to Brick the unusual transactions Corey had questioned in the accounting system. Questions that, if they had reached Brick, would have made him look at Paxton Greer 3 months earlier. 3 months earlier. Maybe early enough. Brick summoned Wes the next evening. Wes came. No one refused when Brick called. That was the first rule, and also the last. Wes walked in, saw Brick sitting at the table, Tully standing behind him, and immediately understood that this meeting wasn't for discussion. No one else was in the room. No lawyer, no witness, no recorder. Only 3 men and 1 question. You knew about Corey and didn't tell me? Brick asked. His voice didn't rise. It didn't fall. It was as flat as the tabletop between them. Wes opened his mouth. Mr. Langston, I didn't know what happened to Corey. I was only asked to stay quiet about those transactions. Greer said it was internal business for his company and had nothing to do with our organization, I thought. You thought. Brick repeated those 2 words. Not as a question. He simply set them in the middle of the room, the way a man sets something heavy on a table. Wes stopped. He had been inside the Langston organization long enough to know that when Brick repeated someone's words, it wasn't because he wanted to hear more. How much did Greer pay you? Brick asked. Wes swallowed. Then he said a number. Small. So small it was shameful when placed beside a human life. Brick heard that number and said nothing more about it. He didn't need to. The number itself was the sentence. Leave, Brick said. Wes looked at him, waiting. In the world Wes had lived in for years, leave didn't only mean step out of the room. It meant step out of the Langston organization. And stepping out of the Langston organization meant that from today on, the Langston name no longer stood behind him. No protection. No network. No door that opened when he knocked. In this world, being cast out of the organization wasn't the lightest punishment, but it wasn't the heaviest either. It was the thing in between, where the punished man had to live with what he had done without anyone standing beside him. Wes stood up. He didn't beg for mercy. He didn't plead. He had been in this world long enough to know that those things didn't work on Brick. and trying them would only make everything worse. Wes walked out of the room. Tully watched him until the door closed. Then Tully spoke softly, without turning his head, his voice flat, but with something heavier than usual lying underneath it. I should have seen it sooner. Brick didn't look at Tully. He stood, fastened the button of his suit jacket, then turned away toward the window. He didn't answer because no answer could change anything. Should have are the two most expensive words in any language. Tully should have seen Wes taking money from Greer. Brick should have asked Corey, "What is it?" when his brother called him for the last time. Corey should have spoken plainly instead of saying, "Never mind, another time." But should have doesn't save anyone. It only stays with the living and reminds them every day that they had a chance and let it pass. Jolene didn't tell Brick. She didn't tell Tully. She didn't tell anyone, because she understood one thing very clearly, and she didn't need anyone to teach her. Brick Langston was looking for the person who had caused his brother's death, not looking for a way to clear her name. Those two goals might overlap today, but there was no guarantee they would still overlap tomorrow. If Brick found Paxton Greer and handled everything his own way, Brick's story would end, but Jolene's story wouldn't. In the court system, she was still Jolene Langston. The file was still open. Her account was still frozen, and the police still thought she was the woman who had married a man in order to seize $2,300,000. She needed her own evidence she found herself, kept herself, and could produce when necessary, without depending on the goodwill of a Mafia boss she had known for less than a week. Jolene took out her phone and opened the photos of Doug's file that she had taken from the clinic. The job application, the home address on the third line. She knew that address could be fake, that everything about Doug could be fake, but it was the only thing she had. She took the bus to the address on the file, an old apartment complex on the south side of the city. Doug wasn't there anymore. She had known that in advance, but she hadn't come to look for Doug in his old place. She had come to ask. She knocked on the apartment next door. An older man opened it, the kind of man who had lived in the same place long enough to know everyone who came and went on his floor. Jolene asked about Doug. The neighbor remembered. "That guy moved out months ago, but I still see him around here. He works at the pawn shop on Halsted Street, 4 blocks from here." 4 blocks. Jolene walked. With every step, she asked herself what she was doing. She wasn't a detective. She had no weapon. She had no one with her. She was a 27-year-old woman walking to face a man who had tricked her into signing papers that had destroyed her life. And she had nothing in her hands except an old phone and anger she refused to let show in her voice. She turned on the voice recorder on her phone before stepping into the shop. The pawn shop was small, with yellow light and a glass counter. Doug stood behind the counter. He looked up when he heard the door chime. His eyes met Jolene's, and his first reaction told her more than any words ever could. He flinched. Not the way someone flinches from unexpectedly running into an acquaintance. The way someone flinches when he sees something that was never supposed to appear again. "Jolene." He said her name. Not hello, not what do you need. He said her name like a man speaking the name of a file he thought had already been closed. "You remember me," Jolene said. It wasn't a question. "Of course you remember. You had me sign employee insurance papers 6 months ago at the clinic, except they weren't insurance papers." Doug looked quickly toward the door, then back at her. His eyes were calculating. Jolene recognized it. The kind of look belonging to someone weighing whether to lie, tell the truth, or run. "I don't know what you're talking about," Doug said, but his voice had already changed, half a pitch higher, half a beat faster, and anyone who had been lied to often enough in life could recognize that sound. "You're still working for Greer," Jolene said. She didn't know for certain. She guessed. But she guessed with the voice of someone making a statement, and that difference decided everything. Doug looked at her, and in that moment, he gave himself away, not through a confession, but through the way he didn't deny it. Through the way he looked toward the door a second time, as if checking whether anyone had followed Jolene there. Through the way he lowered his voice when he spoke his next sentence. "You should leave. You don't understand what you're caught up in. Then tell me so I can understand. You're not the only one, all right?" Doug said quickly, his voice hissing through his teeth. "You think you're special? You're just a name on a list. And the people who cause trouble on that list, Greer, cleans them up. Do you understand what I'm saying? Cleans them up." Jolene understood. She understood more clearly than Doug imagined. She understood that cleans them up was the phrase people used when they didn't want to say out loud what had happened to the women on the list who could no longer be reached by anyone. She understood that Corey Langston might also have been cleaned up. And she understood that the phone in her pocket was recording every word. "Thank you," Jolene said. Then she turned and walked out. Fast, not running, because running would make Doug reconsider what he had just said and whom he had said it to. She walked, steady, past the shop door, past the sidewalk, past the corner. She turned left, out of sight. Then she stopped, leaned her back against the wall, and looked down at her hands. Her hands were shaking, both of them, shaking so badly that she had to use her left hand to hold the phone because her right hand couldn't do it. But inside that phone was Doug's voice, saying she wasn't the only one, saying Greer cleaned up anyone who caused trouble, saying she should leave if she still wanted peace. Her hands were shaking, but she had what she needed. The list of 15 names Margot Sable had given was on Tully's phone, and Brick had already sent people to check every single one. But Jolene didn't need anyone to check the 9th name on that list, Tessa Polk. She knew that name, not in the way someone reads a name on paper and then forgets it, but in the way you know someone you once sat beside in the common room of a shared house for young women, the kind of house people entered when they had nowhere else to go, and left when they found a job that paid enough to rent the cheapest room available. Jolene was 19 when she lived there. Tessa was 20. They weren't close friends. They weren't sisters. They were simply two people who had once shared the same shelf in a communal bathroom and sometimes talked on nights when neither of them could sleep. The kind of talks people only have with someone from the same circumstances because they know that person will understand without needing an explanation. Then Jolene left the shared house. Tessa left too. They didn't stay in touch. Not because they didn't want to, but because when you live one day at a time, you don't have the energy to maintain ties. Life doesn't force you to keep. Now the name Tessa Polk was on the list of 15 women used as wives on paper, and Jolene looked at that name on the phone screen with a feeling she didn't know how to name, heavier than anger, deeper than sadness, closest perhaps to fear, because if this had happened to Tessa, then it wasn't a coincidence. It was a system, and that system chose similar people for the same reason. It took Jolene 2 days to find Tessa. It wasn't difficult, because Tessa didn't have the means to go far. She lived in a rented room on the 3rd floor of an old building on the east side of the city, the kind of room where the rent was so low that no one asked the tenant's name. Jolene knocked on the door. There was no answer. She knocked again. "Tessa, it's Jolena Ward, from the shared house on Garfield Street." The silence stretched long enough for Jolene to think she had been wrong, that Tessa wasn't here, or that Tessa was here but didn't want to open the door for anyone. Then the lock turned. The door opened, only wide enough for a face to look out. Tessa looked different from Jolene's memory, not because of time, but because of fear. Fear changes how people look. It narrows their eyes, pulls their shoulders inward, and makes the way they stand seem as if they're ready to step back even farther, even when they're already pressed against the wall. "Jolene, I need to talk to you," Jolene said. "About Paxton Greer." That name struck Tessa as if someone had slammed a hand down on a table inside a closed room. She started to shut the door. Jolene placed her hand on it, lightly, not forcing it, only holding it there. "I'm on that list too, Tessa. I was married on paper to a man I'd never met. I know you were too." Tessa looked at her, for a long time, then she opened the door wider. The room was small. Tessa sat on the edge of the bed, and Jolene sat in the only chair. Tessa told her story. Not much, but enough. One day, someone knocked on her door and asked her about her husband's assets. She didn't have a husband. She said so. That person produced a marriage certificate bearing her name and the name of an elderly businessman she had never heard of. Tessa panicked, went to the police station, and explained. The police looked at the paperwork, looked at her, and said that in the system, she was the legal wife, and if she believed there had been a mistake, she should hire a lawyer. Hire a lawyer. With what money? After that, someone came to see Tessa. He didn't give a name. He didn't say whom he represented. He only said that if Tessa stayed silent, everything would be fine. And if she didn't stay silent, everything wouldn't be fine. Tessa stayed silent. From then until now. "I can't testify," Tessa said, her voice small but firm in the way of someone who had made the decision long ago and didn't want to make it again. I don't have anyone, Jolene. If something happens to me, no one will know. Jolene looked at Tessa. She looked at Tessa's hands resting on her lap, clenched tight, nails cut short, skin dry from too much work, and she realized those hands looked so much like her own that they could be switched, and no one would know the difference. I don't have anyone either, Jolene said. That's why they chose us, because no one would ask if we stopped showing up. But now you have me, and I have you. If one person speaks, they can ignore her. If two people speak, they have to explain. And if two people speak out together with evidence in their hands, they can't pretend they don't hear. Tessa didn't answer right away. She sat still, looking down at her hands, and Jolene didn't push. She waited, because she knew this wasn't the kind of decision people made because they were persuaded by logic. It was the kind of decision people made when they looked into the eyes of someone like themselves and realized that staying silent wasn't any safer than speaking out. If I testify, Tessa said slowly, will you stand beside me? I'll stand beside you, Jolene said, because no one else will. Tessa looked at her for a little while longer. Then she nodded. Once. Faintly. But it was enough. Doug called Paxton Greer 15 minutes after Jolene left the pawn shop. Jolene didn't know that. But the consequence of that call came for her that very night. She left Tessa's place at 9 o'clock in the evening and walked back toward the East Side apartment Brick had arranged for her. It was a familiar route. She had walked it a few times during the past week, past 2 blocks of houses, turning left at the corner by the closed laundromat, then straight to the end of the street. A 7-minute walk. She had been walking for 5 minutes when she realized there were people ahead of her. 2 men stood in the middle of the sidewalk, about 10 steps away. They weren't standing the way people stood while waiting for a car or waiting for someone. They were standing as if they were waiting for her. Jolene stopped. Her instinct told her to turn back. Her life experience told her that turning back wouldn't change anything, because if they knew she took this route, then they knew where she lived, and turning back only meant meeting them somewhere else. Another time, maybe when she was less prepared, one of the 2 men stepped forward, not in a hurry, the kind of step belonging to someone who didn't need to hurry because he already knew the outcome. He stopped 3 steps away from her, close enough to speak without raising his voice. You're asking questions no one wants to hear, he said. So someone asked us to come remind you that some questions should stop while they still can. The second man stood behind him, blocking the way. Jolene looked at the man in front of her. She couldn't see his face clearly in the dark. Only his shape, broad shoulders, hands tucked into his coat pockets. The relaxed posture of someone doing a job he didn't consider important. Do you understand what I'm saying? He asked. Jolene understood. She understood very clearly. She also understood that if she nodded and went home, tonight would end quietly, and tomorrow she would stay silent, and next week she would still be Jolene Langston on paper, and next month she would become one more name on the list of people no one could reach anymore. Jolene screamed. She screamed as loudly as she could. Not a cry for help, not clear words, just sound, loud and sharp, the kind of sound that tore through the stillness of a street at night and forced every door within half a block to pay attention. The man in front of her reacted quickly. He stepped forward and grabbed her arm. Jolene yanked free. She pulled with the full weight of her body, not with technique, only with the survival instinct of someone who had learned very early that when someone grabbed your hand and you didn't want them to, you had to pull away immediately, because every second of delay was another second you lost control. She got free. Her wrist was scraped, burning, but her hand was free. She screamed again. This time, lights came on in the building beside her. A window opened, and there were footsteps from the end of the street. Fast, heavy, more than one person. 2 of Brick's men appeared from around the corner. Jolene hadn't known they were there. She hadn't known Brick had sent people to watch and protect her from the day he arranged the apartment. But they were there, and they arrived quickly enough. The 2 men on the sidewalk saw Brick's men, assessed the situation in less than 2 seconds, then withdrew. They didn't run, but they moved very fast, turning into the alley across the street and disappearing. Brick's men didn't chase them. They stopped beside Jolene and asked if she was hurt. She said no, but her hands were shaking, for the second time that day, and the scrape on her wrist was bleeding lightly. The kind of scrape that wasn't dangerous but was enough to remind her that 10 seconds earlier, her hand had been in someone else's grip against her will. Brick arrived within 20 minutes. The black SUV stopped close to the curb. He stepped out, with Tully following behind him. Brick didn't ask, "Are you all right?" He went straight to Jolene, looked down at her hand, looked at the scrape on her wrist, and stayed with that detail for 2 seconds before lifting his eyes. Those 2 seconds said more than any question of concern ever could. Then he turned to Tully. "Find out who sent them, before morning." Brick's voice was low, lower than usual, almost a whisper, and Tully, who had stood beside Brick for 19 years, understood that this was the most dangerous level, because Brick never raised his voice when he was truly angry. He lowered it, and when Brick lowered his voice, everything around him should begin to worry. "You went to see Doug?" Brick said, turning back to Jolene. Not a question. He already knew, or had figured it out, because Brick wasn't the kind of man who needed anyone to explain a chain of cause and effect to him. Jolene didn't deny it. "I needed my own evidence," she said. Her voice stayed steady, even though her hands were still trembling. "You're investigating for your brother. I'm investigating for myself. I don't know how long those two things will keep going in the same direction." Brick looked at her. It was the look Jolene had begun to recognize, the measuring, calculating, classifying look. But this time, there was something different underneath it. Not softness. Brick didn't have that word in his emotional vocabulary, but something closer to a thing he hadn't named yet. "What did you get from Doug?" he asked. Jolene took out her phone, opened the recording file, pressed play. Doug's voice came through the small speaker, clear in the quiet night. "You're not the only one, all right? You're just a name on a list. And the people who cause trouble on that list, Greer cleans them up." Brick listened until it ended. He looked at the phone, then at Jolene, then at the scrape on her wrist again. Then he spoke, slowly, clearly, each word carrying its own weight. "From now on, you stay somewhere I can see you. Not because I don't trust you." He stopped. "Because they know your face." Jolene looked at him. She wanted to say she didn't need anyone to protect her. She wanted to say she had taken care of herself for the past 27 years without needing anyone. But her wrist was still bleeding, and the 2 men on the sidewalk 10 minutes earlier weren't the kind of trouble stubbornness could solve alone. "All right," she said. One word, and inside that word was something she had never given anyone before. Not trust. Not yet. But the acceptance that maybe, for the first time, she didn't have to face everything alone. After the night Jolene was stopped on the sidewalk, Brick ordered Tully to go back to Corey's apartment. It wasn't the first time Tully had been there. He had gone there right after Corey died, along with 2 other men, to gather personal belongings, pack them up, and move them into the Langston family storage. But that time, Tully had been cleaning out the things of a man who had died in a traffic accident. This time, Tully was searching through the things of a man who had died because he knew too much. Different. The way he searched was different too. Tully wasn't looking for clothes or keepsakes. He was looking for something Corey had wanted to hide. And Corey, gentle as he was, as much as he hated violence, was still Broderick Langston's younger brother, which meant he knew how to hide things. Tully turned over every book on the shelf. Corey read a lot, and the bookshelf took up an entire wall in the small apartment. The 17th book, a business law textbook Corey had used in college, opened in Tully's hands, and a USB drive fell out, lying neatly inside a hollow space Corey had cut into the pages. Small, black, no label. Tully brought it back to Brick within 1 hour. Brick sat at the desk in the penthouse. Jolene was in the next room, where Brick had moved her after what happened the night before. He didn't call her in. He plugged the USB drive into his laptop, opened the only folder inside, a video file, small in size, recorded by webcam, not high quality, but clear enough. Brick pressed play. Corey's face appeared on the screen. His younger brother sat in front of the camera, with the white wall of the apartment Tully had searched that morning behind him. Corey looked tired. Not tired from lack of sleep, but tired in the way a person looks after carrying something far too heavy alone for far too long. Red eyes, uncombed hair, wrinkled shirt. He looked straight into the camera. And when he began to speak, his voice didn't shake, but it was slow, the kind of slow that came from someone trying to choose every word carefully, because he knew this might be the last time he would get to say them. "Brother Brick, if you're watching this, it means I couldn't handle this on my own." Corey stopped, swallowed, looked down at his hands, then looked up again. "There's an operation. Paxton Greer is running it. I worked as an accountant for the company connected to him. You already know that. I found out they're using women as wives on paper. Women with no families, no one. They take signatures, create fake marriage certificates, transfer assets through the name of a legal wife. 15 women in 4 years, maybe more. Corey stopped again, this time longer. I found one file. The name was Jolene Ward. He said that name slowly, clearly, as if spelling it out so the person listening could write it down. She has no one, brother. No family, no relatives. They chose her because no one would look if she couldn't be reached anymore. I met Paxton. I demanded that he remove her name from the list. He said yes. Corey looked straight into the camera. But I don't believe him. Silence. Long. Corey opened his mouth, as if to say more, then stopped. Then he spoke, his voice lower, almost as if he were talking to himself. If you're watching this, brother, find her. She definitely doesn't know what's happening. The video ended. The screen went black. Brick sat motionless. His hands rested on the desk, on either side of the laptop keyboard. Not clenched, not tightened, just placed there. Flat, as if moving any part of his body would make something inside him break open with it. And he wasn't sure he could gather it back again. Corey, his younger brother, the boy he had protected since they were small, the brother he had always thought was too gentle for this world, too soft, too willing to believe in things Brick had stopped believing in a long time ago. The brother who had called him and said, "Brother, I need to tell you something." And Brick had said, "All right, another time," because he was busy. The brother who had heard him say another time, then hung up and handled it alone. And died. Brick didn't cry. He didn't know how, or he had forgotten how a very long time ago. But he sat there, before the black screen, and didn't move. And that was the closest version of crying Broderick Langston could allow himself. Jolene stood in the doorway. She hadn't been invited in, but she had heard Corey's voice from the next room, and she had walked to the door, and she had stood there, and she had heard everything. She didn't try to hide it. She stood in the doorway, and she cried. Not loudly, not sobbing. Only tears running down the face of someone standing still and listening to a man she had never met say her name in a video recorded before he died, because he had tried to save her, a complete stranger, simply because he had read her file and seen that she had no one, and that had made it impossible for him to turn away. Brick spoke, without turning around, his voice hoarse, the voice of a man speaking through something heavier than words. "My brother died trying to save you. It wasn't your fault, but I won't let that death mean nothing." Jolene wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She drew in a breath, and when she spoke, her voice no longer trembled. "Your brother died trying to save me. I owe him, and I won't stop until Paxton Greer pays for that." She wasn't begging. She wasn't promising. She was declaring. It was the voice of someone who had crossed through fear and reached the other side, where fear was still there, but no longer the thing deciding the next step. Brick turned around. For the first time in the conversation, he looked at Jolene, and Jolene looked at him. The two of them looked at each other across a room where, between them, there was a black screen and the voice of a dead man, a man who had connected them before either one knew the other existed. Brick nodded. Once, no more needed to be said. Because both of them understood that from this moment on, this was no longer the story of Brick searching for the person he would punish for his brother. It was no longer the story of Jolene searching for evidence to clear her own name. This was the story of both of them, and it would end the way Corey Langston had wanted, even if he was no longer here to see it. Brick didn't rush. After the night he watched Corey's video, he didn't immediately charge out to find Paxton Greer. He didn't call his people, didn't give orders, didn't move. He sat at his desk until 3 o'clock in the morning, alone, then stood, washed his face, changed his shirt, and began working with the cold precision of a man who had set his emotions aside and kept only his purpose. Brick Langston could find Paxton Greer within 1 day. He had people, connections, the ability to put Paxton inside a closed room and ask any question he wanted in any way he wanted. That was the old way, the way the Langston organization had operated since his father's time. But Brick didn't use that way, because Corey wouldn't have wanted that, and because Brick realized that the best way to destroy a man who lived by paperwork was to use paperwork itself. He had people watch Paxton. No approach, no attention, only observation. Where Paxton went, whom he met, what time he entered the office, what time he left, which phone he used, which car he drove. At the same time, Tully traced the money. From Margot's statement, from Doug's file, from the unusual transactions Corey had marked in the accounting system before he died. Every transaction led to an account. Every account led to a false name. Every false name led to a property bought with money transferred through the names of women who didn't know they had been married. The network appeared like a map. Brick looked at it and saw 15 years of Paxton Greer's work built on a foundation where every brick was the life of a woman whose identity had been stolen. Brick compiled everything. Margot Sable's testimony, Jolene's recording of Doug, Tessa Polk's statement, Corey's video, the accounting books, the money trail through false accounts, the list of 15 victims. He placed it all into one single file. Complete, systematic, the kind of file a federal prosecutor would look at and understand that they were holding the biggest case of the year. Brick sent the file to the FBI through the private attorney of the Langston organization. Not directly, because Brick wasn't a man who stood in front of cameras and answered questions. He was the man who stood behind everything and made sure things happened exactly the way he intended. At the same time, he had Tully send an envelope to Paxton Greer's office. No sender's name, no message. Inside were only two things: a copy of Margot Sable's testimony and the audio file of the conversation between Doug and Jolene, transcribed onto paper, word for word. No threat, no warning, only evidence, so Paxton could read it and understand for himself. Paxton Greer received the envelope at 9 o'clock in the morning, inside his office, on the oak desk he had sat behind for 15 years while building his operation. He opened the envelope the way he opened any other envelope during the day, because he received dozens of envelopes every morning, and none of them had ever contained anything that made him worry. He read the first page. Margot Sable's testimony. His name appeared on the third line. He read the second page. Doug's transcript. You're not the only one. You're just a name on a list, and the people who cause trouble on that list, Greer cleans them up. Paxton set the paper down. Slowly. His hand didn't shake, because Paxton Greer wasn't the kind of man who shook, but his eyes changed. The kind of change that comes over a man when he sees the entire structure he has spent 15 years building begin to crack from the foundation, and knows there is no way to repair a crack in the foundation without tearing down the whole building. He looked around the office, the oak desk, the shelves of law books, the framed license to practice hanging on the wall, all the things he had used to build the image of a trustworthy attorney, and he understood, with the cold clarity of a man who had used paperwork to trap other people throughout his career, that paperwork itself had just trapped him. No one had come to threaten him. No one had called to warn him. No one had stormed into his office with weapons or threats. There were only 2 sheets of paper in an envelope with no name, and those 2 sheets had told him that everything was already over before he could even pick up the phone to call an attorney for himself. 30 minutes later, the FBI knocked on the door. Paxton Greer was arrested at his office. Margot Sable was arrested the same day at her private home in the suburbs. A federal warrant was issued for Doug. The court voided every fake marriage record connected to the operation, including the marriage certificate between Jolene Ward and Corey Langston. Jolene's bank account was unfrozen, and the $472.17 were still there, waiting for her, as if no one had ever touched them. In the system, her name was Jolene Ward, not Jolene Langston, not a suspect, not anyone's wife, just her. 1 week after everything ended on paper, Jolene went to the cemetery. She went alone. She didn't tell Brick. She didn't tell anyone. She took the bus, got off at the stop 2 blocks from the cemetery gate, and walked the rest of the way. The morning was quiet, neither sunny nor rainy, the kind of weather people didn't notice because there was nothing worth noticing about it. And Jolene thought that suited the moment because she hadn't come here to do anything grand. She had only come to say a few words to someone who would never hear them. Corey Langston's grave was in the eastern section, the family area, with a stone marker carved with his full name, the year he was born, and the year he died, 28 years old. Jolene stood before the stone and thought that 28 years was an almost unbelievably short time for a life. But in those 28 years, Corey Langston had done something many people who lived to 80 never did. He had seen a stranger inside a paper file and decided she deserved to be saved, even though he didn't know her face, even though she didn't know his name, even though no one had forced him to do it. Jolene placed the bouquet in front of the grave. Flowers bought at the convenience store near the bus stop, the cheapest kind available, wrapped in white paper, with no bow, no card. But she had brought it here with her own money, $4 from the account that had just been reopened, and it was the most honest bouquet anyone could have placed before a grave. "I didn't know you," Jolene said, her voice small, not because she was afraid someone would hear, but because she was speaking to someone beneath the earth, and she felt no need to speak loudly. "But you saw me when no one else did. You read my file, and you saw that I had no one. And instead of turning to the next page, you stopped. You stopped because of me." She drew in a breath. "Thank you." She stood there a while longer. A soft wind moved through the cemetery, and the grass was lush and green, the kind of green people only saw in places cared for more carefully than anywhere Jolene had ever lived. She didn't cry. She had cried enough already, in Brick's room, when Corey's voice came from the laptop at midnight. Today, she didn't cry. Today, she simply stood before the grave of a stranger who had saved her, and let the silence speak in her place. Footsteps behind her. Jolene didn't turn around. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Those footsteps were even firm. Each step spaced the same distance apart, the way a man walked when he never hurried because everything waited for him. Brick stopped beside her. No greeting. No asking how long she had been here or how she had come. He only stood there, looking at the grave marker bearing his brother's name, and let the silence remain between them as something no one needed to break. They stood like that for a long time, not speaking, not looking at each other, only looking forward together, toward the place where Corey Langston lay beneath the green grass, never knowing that the two people he had brought together were standing side by side before his grave. Then Brick took an envelope from the pocket of his suit jacket, white, neither thick nor thin. He handed it to Jolene without speaking. Jolene accepted it, opened it. Inside was a set of papers, a letter confirming a full scholarship for a vocational training program, issued by a charitable foundation funded by the Langston organization. Not cash, not a check, a door. The kind of door Jolene Ward had never had anyone open for her in 27 years of living. Jolene looked at the papers. Then she looked at Brick. Why? Brick didn't look at her. He looked at the grave marker. "Because my brother would have wanted it." He stopped. Then he added, his voice lower, almost meant only for himself and the stone in front of him. "And because you deserve a beginning no one has ever given you." Jolene looked down at the envelope in her hand. The papers inside weighed less than 100 grams, but their true weight couldn't be measured by any scale, because they were proof that someone had looked at her life, her whole, small, cramped, nameless life, and decided that life deserved more than that, not because of anything she had done, but because of who she was. She didn't say thank you, not because she wasn't grateful, but because there are moments when thank you is too small for what is happening, and she thought Brick understood that, because he wasn't waiting for her to say it either. They left the cemetery together. Jolene sat in the passenger seat, the envelope lying on her lap, her hand resting on it gently as if she were touching something fragile, even though it was only paper. Brick drove. He said nothing for the first 10 minutes, and Jolene didn't either, because both of them had just left the place where Corey lay, and both of them needed time to set that moment down before picking up anything else. Brick turned onto a small street and stopped in front of a coffee shop. Not the kind of elegant place people would imagine a mafia boss going to. Just a small shop, with a striped awning, a few tables out on the sidewalk. The kind of place people entered because it was convenient, not because they wanted to be seen. "I haven't had breakfast," Brick said. Jolene looked at him, looked longer than necessary. Then she spoke, and in her voice there was something Brick had never heard from her before. Lighter, closer, the kind of tone people only use when they begin allowing themselves to feel comfortable in someone's presence. "A mafia boss needs someone to have breakfast with him too?" Brick didn't laugh. Broderick Langston wasn't a man who laughed easily, and the past weeks had given him no reason to laugh, but the corner of his mouth shifted upward. Just a little. For the first time since Corey died, not a smile, but a sign that somewhere inside this man, behind the steel and discipline and coldness he wore every day like a suit jacket, something still knew how to respond to warmth. "Maybe," he said. Jolene opened the car door and stepped out first. She didn't look back. She walked toward the coffee shop with steady steps, the envelope in her hand, her back straight, and she knew he was following behind her because she could hear his footsteps on the sidewalk. Even, firm, keeping just enough distance. And for the first time, that didn't frighten her. For the first time since the night the black SUV had rolled after her along the sidewalk, the sound of Broderick Langston's footsteps behind her wasn't something she wanted to run from. It was something she was willing to let be there. Not because she needed him, but because she chose. And maybe, just maybe, he chose too. Sometimes in life, the people no one thinks about, the people no one would search for if they disappeared, are the very people who deserve to be seen the most. A person's worth doesn't lie in the name written on paper. It doesn't lie in the amount of money in a bank account. It doesn't lie in how many people know you exist. It lies in how you treat those who can give you nothing in return. Corey Langston understood that. He saw a name in a file, a woman who had no one, and he decided she deserved to be saved, even though he had never met her, even though no one had asked him to do it, even though the cost was his own life. He didn't live long enough to see the result. He didn't live long enough to know that the woman he had tried to save stood before his grave with the cheapest bouquet of flowers and the truest thank you. He didn't live long enough to know that his older brother, the man he had always thought would never understand him, finally did understand. But the truth Corey left behind on the USB drive hidden between the pages of a book saved Jolene Ward. And perhaps, in some way, it saved Brick too. Because sometimes, to change a person, you don't have to stand beside them. You only have to show them that there are still people in this world willing to do what is right, no matter the cost. If this story touched you, please press like and share it so more people can hear it. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next story, because the best story may be the one you haven't heard yet. We want to know how you feel after this story. Please leave a comment sharing what is deep in your heart. We read every line and treasure every word. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.